the thing that stood out to me the most was Florida State bullying Alabama to a final score of 31-17. We will always talk about the winners before the losers, so I'm kind of burying the lead in this storyline. But to talk about Florida State for a second, the funny thing about this game is that on last Wednesday's show, when I was previewing the bout between these two teams, I said that Florida State was one of the more improved teams in the nation. I said that they were in the mix to win the ACC this year. But I didn't see that coming in a million years. Florida State finished with 236 yards on the ground, held Bama to 3 yards per carry. Mike Norvell deserves so much applause for how quickly he is able to adapt to things. And you say that, well, how did he go through a 2-10 season? There were a lot of things that went poorly. He missed on a couple key positions in the transfer portal, and things kind of unraveled from that opening season loss that they had at Georgia Tech. Mike Norvell deserves a lot of credit for both the coordinator additions he made this past offseason, adding in Gus Malzahn to run the defense, Tony White, who had a pretty, short but recent history of doing really good things with both Nebraska and Syracuse's defense. And then they reshuffled a lot of their major positions on the roster. And unlike last year, where they tried to bring in these unproven talents and take a shot on guys that, maybe were former 5-stars that didn't get things panned out in their first or their second destination. They were like, oh, well, I can fix them. He tried to do a lot of fixing for certain prospects last transfer portal. This time, he took a look at productive players, guys that have been around for a while, specifically in the trenches. He obviously took another shot at wide receiver and Squirrel White, and there's Thomas Castellanos at quarterback. He did a lot of reshuffling, but it was high-floor players that were collectively going to make this team substantially better than the 2-10 record that they had last year. When you combine a high floor on the roster and you combine really strong coaching additions, you get a pretty damned good football team. So hats off to Mike Norvell for that. Hats off to Thomas Castellanos in this game. He finished with 9 of 14 passing, 152 through the air. Didn't have to really do too much, but that's because on the ground he went for 78 and a touchdown. The offense as a whole, like I said, it wasn't just 4 quarters of dominance, but it was very opportunistic. I thought they did a great job. It wasn't intentional that it went this way, but as soon as the rain started coming down and the game got a little messy late in the second quarter, I thought Florida State's offense was very opportunistic at that point of the year. And even when Bama's defense tightened up in the second half, there were a few possessions where I was kind of like, is Bama going to do this? Are we going to hit this live money line and really pull out a nice win here? They made enough plays when it mattered most. So Thomas Castellanos stood on business. He talked a lot of shit this past offseason leading up to this game. 9 times out of 10, that shit doesn't work, and it did here. So hats off to the coaching staff, this roster. I think where I land with Florida State big picture, it's hard to not feel better about where I was last week. I said this is a team that will be in the mix for an ACC title berth. Now, the worst thing that we can do in week 1 of a college football season is overreact. And I will remind us that when we talk about every single team I have on this doc here. But this is one of those, season momentum building wins. You host Alabama, you're 2 touchdown underdogs, and you just dominate them on both sides of the football. That is something that can really light a fire in a roster and a coaching staff. They came ready to play on Saturday and had probably the biggest outcome of the entire weekend, getting that quality win there and really positioning themselves in a good spot to roll into conference play in a weakened SEC and just feel better about that. Like, who else in the ACC right now feels as good as Florida State does after that win? And you'd say a lot of these programs, like, Georgia Tech gets a quality win over Colorado. It was a little bit back and forth. A lot of these teams didn't really play quality opponents. SMU, I'm recording this before Miami kicks off with Notre Dame. Maybe it is Notre Dame. I should mention that Miami, they're playing Notre Dame. If they go in and they win by 20, Miami probably feels a little bit better than FSU does at this point. But from what we saw on Saturday, Florida State put themselves in a really solid position to I guess kind of just rebound from what was a really bad 2024 year. And Mike Norvell, people were, chit-chattering about the hot seat, about, okay, well, if Florida State overall is a sub 500 program with him, despite the 13-0 season, what are you really getting? Again, don't want to overreact. Very good start to the season for the Seminoles here. So very, very impressive for them to get that win. And now, despite all that, sadly enough for FSU, it's a great win. It's an even bigger storyline for the team that resides in Tuscaloosa. Now, as I just said with Florida State, as we'll say with Clemson and LSU and Texas and Ohio State, you don't want to overreact too quickly. But Alabama showed me everything in week 1 that was supposed to be a thing of the past after 2024. I spent this entire offseason believing that Kalen Deboer had gotten out the bad players and the bad vibes and the guys that only were there because they were getting the money, or the guys that were there because of Saban and they didn't want to be there for Deboer. They had cleaned things up at the quarterback position. It was not going to be sloppy. Kalen Deboer was going to get his grip around this program. Everything that was frustrating about the Alabama Crimson Tide in 2024 showed up in this week 1 game. 8 penalties for 70 yards. I think they averaged 7 to 8 penalties per last season. A lot of different miscommunications defensively, misassignments. They really struggled with misdirection, which Gus Malzahn took advantage of plenty. Really struggled with the running quarterback. Thomas Castellanos, I think, finished with 80 yards on the ground. And when we painted Florida State's path to a victory, it was Castellanos making things happen on the ground. Last year it was Jackson Arnold putting up 130. Diego Pavia, I think, had around 60. Castellanos wasn't perfect through the air, but what he was able to do on the ground just kept this defense on its toes. So you had a ton of really bad penalties, a couple of them like crucial third downs, a couple of late hits. You had struggles with the quarterback and his mobility, his two-way capabilities, motion, which Gus Malzahn drew up a really good game plan to take down this defense. Outside of the first drive for Alabama, this was one of those where, again, as someone who picked Alabama to be their national champion, as the number 1 team in the nation, I believe, this preseason, you go through that opening drive and you're like, that's Alabama football. That's how we do it. That's what I picked. They had 56 rushing yards on that opening drive, and I think like 25 or 26 the rest of the game. There was no disruptance on either side of the trenches. And I did mention when talking about Florida State here that there were a couple of drives where Alabama's defense was getting these, quick 3-and-outs or blowing up plays in the trenches or bringing Castellanos down. But for the majority of the game, they weren't generating much push defensively. They just didn't look like a team that wanted to be out there. The effort was really bad. I have a really fun number here for you. So maybe this isn't the stats department. This is just 2 numbers that make you say, wow, but we'll put on the glasses here for the analytics department. Alabama's starting offensive line averages 328 pounds. Florida State's defensive line, and I'm talking the starters and the guys behind them, average 286 pounds. Nearly a 40-pound difference, more than a 40-pound difference. Yet, if you're watching that game, you wouldn't have been able to tell. Florida State wanted that game more than Alabama did. They, from the get-go, had more juice. And like I said, despite being completely undersized, it came down to an effort and who wanted it more. And Alabama, man, it didn't look like they gave 2 shits about that game, which is the most concerning part about it. You can talk about, Ty Simpson having some bad throws or some poor decision making. You could talk about the run game without Jam Miller not having much of a presence. You could talk about Ryan Williams not making his impact on the game, although Jeremy Bernard was a fantastic player, probably the best performer for Alabama on Saturday. The effort and the commitment and the fight, not being able to do that and crawl out of that deficit to win that game where you have a significant talent edge at just about every position. That's what's really concerning here. And to move along now, Kalen Deboer in his last 10 games with the Crimson Tide is 5-5. They have lost to 4 unranked teams in that span. I heard this one earlier today when listening to some recap shows. Kalen Deboer has played, 14 games as the head coach, or he's coached 14 games as the head coach of the Crimson Tide. Every single game, his team has been the more penalized one. There has never been another team that has passed them in penalties for that, individual game. Talent cannot outweigh competitive nature. And this was, that was just everything that was on display. Alabama walked in there as 2 touchdown favorites, and they said, we're 2 touchdown favorites, much like they did to Oklahoma or to Vanderbilt. They said, yeah, we're Alabama. We're talented. We've been around here for 20 years. We're all 5 stars or high 4 stars. And these really gritty teams that just want it more said, we don't give a fuck about your star ratings. We don't give a fuck about the logo on your jersey. They went in there and made a mess of Alabama and really puts them in a tough position here. Alabama, I don't want to say it's exactly the same, but I'm going to slightly liken it to when Ohio State lost to Michigan at the end of last regular season. There are only 2 ways for Alabama to respond to this game. There is the path that looks great, where Alabama becomes what they're supposed to be, where the talent matches the effort, where the coaching staff matches the accolades and the recognition that they get. I still believe, talent-wise, this is one of the best 3 rosters in the sport. I think coaching-wise, it is one of the 5 best coaching staffs in the country. But there's not a collective buy-in right now to get the most out of those abilities. So there's 2 ways that this can go. They can reflect on themselves. And they got a couple of nice tune-ups here before Georgia at, I believe, the end of the month. They've got a couple of tune-up games here. Those are going to be very pivotal to watch. How are the penalties? How are the turnovers? How's the communication on defense? If there's a mobile quarterback that comes in, how are they stuffing him up? They've got Georgia at the end of the month, and I think they've got a few weeks here to try and save the Deboer era in Alabama. And I don't mean that to sound dramatic, but if you do not have the buy-in from one of the most talented rosters in the sport, you unfortunately are not the right fit to lead that program. And Kalen Deboer, I think, is one of the best coaches in the sport. There's a reason that in his career, when he goes up against Steve Sarkisian and Dan Lanning and Kirby Smart, he's 6-0. There is something about that. But if you can't get up for every game and you can't take every opponent as seriously as you do those, there's some sort of disconnect between the coaching staff and the players. It will either go the way that Ohio State did last year, where they lose that game, they get in a really passionate team meeting, and they go on this incredible run that leads them to a national championship and really just the entire rewriting of their story. Or they show up to Georgia, they look just as bad as they did on Saturday, and this thing will spiral out of control. And I think if that route happens, you'll be seeing the departure of Kalen Deboer before the end of the calendar year. To me, there's just no in between. There's no in between where Alabama finishes here and they go 8-4. And you're like, wow, look at them. They lost that first week, but they went 8-4. 2026, maybe that'll be the year for them. It's not that type of program. This isn't like a Tennessee where you can, have a couple of 10-win seasons and then you kind of earn the right to maybe take a step back. This is Alabama. It's unfortunate for Kalen Deboer, but Nick Saban has set that precedent. And I don't see it going any other way. This is either going to be one of those where they really dig deep like Ohio State did and they go win it all, or this is the beginning of the end for the Deboer-Alabama relationship.